Yeah, this video is definitely about SmackDown. Now, I don't know if people know this, but a lot of people who used to work as pro wrestlers for Vince used to be SmackDown or Raw superstars. Now, Maria Kanellis did not have a very long, lengthy stint in the WWE. My thought on that is that everything that like either if it be the Spirit Squad or Maria Kanellis or Epico and Primo or Chavo Guerrero. Now about the Chavo Guerrero thing, it's really interesting because he didn't really stick around for very long. Unlike Eddie Guerrero, who stayed around until 2005, who died for whatever reason. Chavo himself didn't stick around very long because he didn't even have like a very valid future in the WWE. He jumped and floated around the mid card or the lower to mid card or the lower card in the WWE for a long time. Then he wound up getting booted from the WWE because he wasn't the top card guy at the time. Now, what's really interesting about that is that WWE just starts letting people go. Perry Saturn, he was let go. Chris Masters, he was let go. JTG, he was let go. And well, also when Christian left to go to a TNA, or as we know as the Impact Zone, he stayed in the Impact Zone for a while, came back for a short time. And then we got some of the scraps from Dixie Carter. You know, like we as WWE connoisseurs of like the WWE brand have been, getting table scraps, like WWE superstars or pro wrestlers that float around in the indie scene, like those mainstream indie scenes type of pro wrestling companies, like the Impact Zone and New Japan Pro Wrestling, and some developmental companies out there. But there's been like some generic offshoot pro wrestling companies that are not as well known as the WWE or Impact Wrestling or ECW or WCW or NXT or AEW. They're not as well known as them. There's only two that are well known: USWA and Ohio Valley Wrestling. Then those two were quickly replaced by NXT as a developmental brand. Now, what's really interesting is that ever since some of the legends that had their extensive careers in in the 80s and in the 90s. So very few of them are still alive. They didn't even renew their contracts. And there are a bunch of part-timers floating around on the WWE's shelf. And some are in the WWE's trash can of talent that are no longer alive. And some that are just, kept on bouncing back and forth, being thrown like a ping pong ball back and forth from SmackDown to Raw. And they've been like bouncing back and forth, and the WWE's playing ping pong with the talent to see who could just make it somewhere in the WWE. But when they introduced 205 Live, there's been a third faction or fourth faction in the WWE of wrestling talent. There's like 4 factions. Used to be 3 factions or 2 factions of wrestling talent in the WWE. During the invasion angle, there was 3 factions: WWE, WCW, ECW. But the WWE faction can consist of 2 sub-factions of Raw and SmackDown. Now, when Ted Turner's WCW went out of business, a lot of the WCW guys wound up coming to the WWE at the time. And then when Eric Bischoff wound up going out of business, a lot of the ECW guys started coming to the WWE. And then and that's how ECW went out of business. Because frankly, also USWA went out of business. Ohio Valley Wrestling went out of business because Vince McMahon was squashing talent based, like beating out the competition like that, going against what Vince McMahon Sr. stated. No taking over territories in the indie scene. Each state had their own independent indie scene, their own independent companies. But when Vince McMahon Jr. wound up taking over the WWE company, back when his father chucked his company to his son, and then the WWE started taking out all the competition all across America, dwarfing every wrestling company. And what is proposed is that the WWE started squashing and just like boom, dying down the competition. But when there was like very few competition left for the WWE to contend with like ECW, WCW, Impact Wrestling, New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is they're not really based in America, and AEW, then the WWE started making their own independent developmental companies. Like we have like Like we have NXT as like a WWE owned. The WWE owned NXT. They're like personal developmental property of developing talent. And then they tried the Tough Enough thing back in the early 2000s, possibly back in the late 90s. Like, gone were the days of you developing your talent in like various wrestling organizations. And it's like hard to get into the WWE then, and it's still hard to get into the WWE now. You'd be barely able to get your foot in the door. Like, you got to pass like some obstacle, like in ancient Greece. And yes, those people who made it in the WWE, who stayed strong in the WWE, who was profitable for Vince McMahon, they got to become legends. Then they started being smacked from like left to right from like being drafted. They're ferociously drafted back and forth once every 2 or 3 years of once every year being chucked back and forth from SmackDown to Raw. And my thoughts on that is the Survivor Series kind of thing, which is where the draft or SummerSlam, where there's only two hold on, I'll be back. I'm back. Now, my thoughts on like the like SummerSlam and Survivor Series are the two possible locations of point of like each year, as where the WWE superstars get drafted on those two um yeah, those exact two pay-per-views, as where when the WWE first like did like drafts for WWE superstars, there have been a lot of people, a lot of these like fans who end up becoming pro wrestlers. I mean, the AJ Lee met Lita, and she was a fan of Lita. Lita was responsible for AJ Lee getting into the WWE kind of stuff. And AJ Lee cried upon meeting Lita because Lita was her favorite wrestler when she was a kid. Now, Lita was jumping back and forth from SmackDown to Raw, from Raw to SmackDown once every year. And yes, with I propose is that with a lot of conviction, a lot of the wrestlers that are indie guys that were in ECW and WCW didn't stick around for very long. And yeah, some of the indie guys and some of the indie girls in Impact Wrestling never made it to the WWE because Dixie Carter did not want her talent to go to the WWE. While Vince McMahon was selling out to massive arenas, Dixie Carter was selling out to small arenas, selling out to them. And when Impact Wrestling started losing popularity, they were the WCW of the 2000s. They were today's WCW/ECW. And then when a couple of people came back, they wound up leaving WWE and EC and not also ECW but also TNA. TNA Impact started losing a lot of talent. I mean, with the WWE just giving some of the wrestling talent the boot, they wound up giving Gail Kim the boot. And with that being said, a lot of people saw that Vince McMahon hated Gail Kim. And then Gail Kim gone and wound up going to the Impact Zone to go and wrestle there. And then she retired still able-bodied, and retired from pro wrestling. From there, only if Vince McMahon would have had to keep her around, she would have been, going about this whole thing about retiring at a later age in the WWE. But Vince McMahon wasn't willing to keep her around because, simple fact, he didn't like her. She floated around in ECW a little bit, and then float around on Raw, float around on SmackDown a little bit, and then she wound up getting kicked out of the WWE, banned from the WWE, and she wound up going to the Impact Wrestling. It's like with AEW and Impact Zone or TNA. That is that is like today's WWF versus ECW and it's like today's version of WWF versus ECW and WCW. And it's like today's version, mild, watered down version of the Monday Night Wars, where some of the WWE talent wound up going out of the WWE into other promotions. And New Japan Pro Wrestling is kind of on the outside. They're on the outside looking in on that kind of thing. And what I'm proposing is that there's like an extremely rare occurrences of Japanese wrestlers integrating into American pro wrestling companies. Now, what I'm proposing is that the WWE has like a token racial representation problem. There's been a significant amount of black wrestlers, white wrestlers, Hispanic wrestlers, and luchadors. And don't get me started on Lucha Underground. They're on the outside looking in on all that crap too. They're on the outside looking in on that. They're alongside New Japan Pro Wrestling. They're watching a lot of the WWE's antics over the past 7 years. And with that being said, we have like Lucha Underground and New Japan Pro Wrestling on the outside looking in, while the Impact Zone tried to steal a lot of the WWE fans, though that they have failed and went out of business probably. And a lot of the AEW guys are former WWE guys, and they have also been like, ever since the Impact Zone have lost a lot of wrestlers. I mean, the Impact Zone just wound up going away. Never had a chance to reach the level of success that the WWE has for like 2 or 3 generations, possibly 4 generations, give or take a few decades, or give or take a few years, or a few members of each generation. Like, what I'm thinking is that the WWE has squashed and started sucker punching out all competition. the WWE wants to be the biggest wrestling company on the planet. They don't want competition, because too much competition is going to start a lot of problems for the WWE. It has caused the WWE most problems back in the day, with ECW and WCW causing problems. And with them causing problems for the WWE, the invasion angle started happening. And the Monday Night Wars was waged, which would have put the WWE in major jeopardy. Now, I'm not saying that Vince McMahon should, be the only, have like the WWE be the only company on the face of the earth that has more media coverage. I'm not saying that. But there's like some random, generic as fuck type of people going around starting nameless and faceless wrestling companies. Like, I see like a lot of generic shit, like generic like wrestling on YouTube. Like, it's all generic as fuck. But I could see why Vince McMahon don't want the WWE to be replaced with like it going back to the days where Vince McMahon Sr. was in charge of the WWE at the time. Because a lot of like every single state in America wound up having their own little pro wrestling promotions. And the WWF wound up having people coming from like all over the country to get signed with the WWE at the time. And Vince McMahon Sr. wanted people to have their contracts expire from other promotions in order for them to get signed to the WWE at the time. Now, I'm not saying that they don't go and just go to one other states or anything like that, or wrestle in one other state. I'm not saying that they don't do that back in the day, but they had to do that to like garner some fans. They had to do that, like go to back and forth to one another state over and over and over again to develop their talent and to build up some recognition. And then the WWE at the time signs them when their original contracts from like the other companies wound up expiring. And what I'm proposing is that ever since Vince McMahon Jr. wound up squashing at all competition, thusly becoming the most famous wrestling company in the entire world, going around the West Coast of this world and going around the East Coast of this world, wrestling all over the world. And what I'm proposing is that a lot of like people go around just blatantly going around joining the WWE. And SmackDown has been, doing the whole brand warfare with Raw during the whole draft process and the Survivor Series and the SummerSlam events and crap like that, where Team Raw and Team SmackDown just fight it out in the ring. to see which brand is more dominant in the WWE's history. Now, what I'm proposing is that they end up going around contending, and then when it is all said and done, they end up doing that, like winning. And it starts all over again once every year. But that's just my thoughts on the WWE on SmackDown from, like, the WWE.